Hi everyone, this is Dolly Begum, your MPP for Scarborough Southwest, and I am so excited today for our special new series edition to talk about the environment and climate crisis, something that many of you have been reaching out over the last few weeks, but throughout the past 2.5 years, as an MPP going, door knocking or on the phone, this is an issue that we have talked about a lot. So I'm really excited because I have my friend and colleague, my mentor, here with me today, who is an expert on this issue, dealing with some of the fights that we're having right now with the current provincial government. So I know he doesn't need any introduction. But before I begin, I do want to give a little bit of an introduction and introduce Peter Tabuns. So Peter Tabuns was elected as the member of provincial parliament for Toronto Danforth in 2006 and was re-elected in 2007, 2011, 2014, and 2018, and is the official opposition critic for energy and climate issues, both of those things that you could call it. Peter continues to bring fresh new ideas to Queen's Park on creating jobs while fighting climate change, keeping people safe from toxins, housing affordability, public transit funding, integrating new Canadians into our economy. And there isn't really anyone on Toronto Danforth or across the city who doesn't know Peter. I am so excited to have my friend and colleague Peter Tabuns join me this evening to talk about the environment. Thank you, Peter.
Dolly, thanks. That was a very kind introduction, and thanks so very much for having me on the show this evening. I gather you wouldn't mind if I started off talking a bit about the climate crisis, and I'm never unhappy to have an opportunity to do that. I want to talk to people about two aspects of this, because if you talk too much about the risks and the threats, people just tend to want to go to bed and pull the covers over their head because it's too much. So I want to talk about the risk and threats because I think there's some that not everyone's familiar with. And I also want to talk about the opportunities that we have that we need to seize, and we need to seize them now. I mean, the threats, I think most people are aware of the fact that as the world gets hotter, as Ontario gets hotter, we're going to have to deal with more extreme weather, more flooding, more extreme storms. We're also going to have to deal with a situation in which forest fires are going to be more common and far harder to control. And we've seen what happened this past year in California, where fires, well, not just in California, up and down the American West Coast, fires created a huge air quality problem. People were forced to stay in their homes. There were rolling blackouts because power lines were either threatened or power lines were causing a risk of more forest fires. We saw the same in Australia last winter for them, or last summer for them, when the fires burned up to the suburbs of Sydney, a major city like Toronto. So there's no doubt that there are big physical risks to us. And here in Ontario, we've already seen the big rises in the level of Lake Ontario. We've seen flooding issues. We know they have a big impact on our economy and on us. People should be aware that as it gets hotter, we'll be dealing with more pandemics. We'll be dealing with more tropical diseases. That's just simply the reality. And we here in Ontario face a threat to our standard of living. In general, the studies that have been done show that if we aren't able to avoid some of the worst elements of the climate crisis, that we'll be looking at an impact comparable to the Great Depression in the 1930s. Huge destruction of income, big lowering of our standard of living. And all of that is pretty hard to deal with, frankly, psychologically as well as practically. But the other side of it, and this is something that people need to grab onto, is that there's an opportunity for us to really remake our economy, rebuild our economy. And with that, there's a huge opportunity to put people to work in a way that many have never been able to work. We will need many skilled professionals in engineering, architecture, accounting. We'll need many skilled tradespeople. If you're replacing fossil fuels with technology that's developed and installed here in Ontario, then you put this huge opportunity in front of us to build our economy in a way that we haven't seen before. And it's an opportunity to deal with inequities. Too often, people are marginalized, women, LGBTQ community, racialized peoples. Open up the economy and give all of those a far better shot at a higher standard of living. And frankly, in phasing out a lot of fossil fuels, we create the opportunity to make our air a lot cleaner. So we have risk on one hand and risk of some pretty heavy duty things. On the other hand, we have the opportunity to make our society a lot better than it is. And we should never forget the risks, but it can be paralyzing for people. It's far better, far more energizing to think about all of the things that we can do to make our lives better. And that's what I keep in mind. And I know that's what my colleagues in the NDP keep in mind as we take on this issue. I'm happy to go further on, Dolly, into the larger discussion, but I wanted to give those opening remarks.
Thank you. I think that actually really sets out how we want to, shape this evening and the conversation. I want to give a shout out to folks who are joining. We have Claire, Dawn, Afsana, who's joined us, Mirza Uncle. There's lots of folks who were watching and commenting as well. And this discussion is really, really vital to our local community as well. And I think the way you just, laid out the ideas of not only are we facing a threat, but we actually have a great opportunity right now for things that we could do. And I want to touch a little bit on what you said in terms of the economy as well, because what COVID has done is it's turned our lives upside down, and people are, they have lost their jobs, they have lost their livelihoods, people are struggling to just get by. But we can actually learn from many of the ways we have kind of reshaped how we look at just different crises and how we can address the climate crisis as well.
Yeah, I think you've raised a really important point. I would say that if you were, talking about this December of 2019, and I had said to you, Dolly, and said to the people who are watching tonight, in about 5 months, we're going to shut down most of the economy. We're going to put in place a guaranteed annual income on a temporary basis. We're going to be investing in small businesses, not enough, but more than we've seen in the past. If I told you we would be mobilizing across the country to come to grips with a really dire pandemic, well, first of all, you would have thought that I really needed a rest and maybe a cold towel on my head. But I don't think it would have been within the realm of what we think about. And now we realize, we have the ability, we have the structures, the democratic structures, to take on these big crises. We took them on before in the world wars in the 20th century, but we haven't taken them on in decades. And now we realize we have that ability and we have the vision. I'm sorry that it wasn't executed better on the pandemic, but we know that we can do this. And we know that we can mobilize large financial resources and human resources fast to take things on. And that's what we're going to need to take on the climate crisis. It's not going to be a question of being successful through half measures. We need to be very bold, very aggressive. And I know this sounds strange, but very optimistic about our abilities, because we can do extraordinary things in this society. Over a century ago, Ontario developed Ontario Hydro. And we had been dependent on importing coal from the United States to power our society, to provide us with electricity. And within about a decade, going from 1905 to 1915, we built power lines across Southern Ontario. We shifted a huge amount of our power demand to renewable hydro. And in doing that, and I don't think many people know the story, we developed technology that Canada sold around the world. Canadian engineers, Canadian planners and architects, logistics experts were in demand globally because we had developed so much. And we can do that again right now, taking on this climate crisis. The pandemic has been, in some ways, an exercise showing us that we do have the strength and the smarts to take on the big challenges.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a few things and we're also getting a lot of folks who are joining in again, talking about some of the ways that we can have specific targets in terms of addressing climate crisis. But I want to kind of step back a little bit and talk about some of the things that just took place in our recent past few weeks from this government, and obviously in the past few decades, what has happened with governments either inaction or sometimes what we saw this earlier this week was government proactively making it worse for our environment. Tell us a little bit about that and what happened.
Well, that's not a happy story, but people need to know that background. So first of all, prior to the 2018 election, we went through a lot of debates and a lot of bills with the former Liberal government. And we in the NDP worked with the Liberals where we could move things forward and put heat on them where they weren't going fast enough. We were actually able to get in place not a fully adequate response, but some response that made a difference. So we were spending, or budgeted to spend, about $2 to $2.5 billion a year on making our homes, making our hospitals, our schools far more energy efficient, putting tens of thousands of people to work, right? Investing in electric vehicles so we could cut out all of that pollution, carbon and otherwise, from operating our transportation system. We were getting, even though it was inadequate, we were getting some things done. And with the election of the Ford government, all of that got scrapped. Hospitals that would have had their operating costs cut because they would have cut their energy use, that was stopped. Schools, likewise, that was stopped. There was a requirement in the building code to put in all of the wiring for charging electric vehicles in each new home, which is pretty cheap. If you have to do it afterwards, it's pretty expensive. But if you're doing it while the house is being built, really, it's a minimal cost. He got rid of that. His administration tore the electric vehicle charging stations out of GO stations. And if you're going to make the transition to electric cars, you're going to need charging stations in a lot of locations. So he undermined the base, I think, for increasing electric car production in Ontario. So it wasn't just that he was saving his developer buddies a few bucks on each house that was built. He was undermining our ability to expand into this new economy. So those were the negative things he did. Oh, and he also canceled a wind farm in Prince Edward County, and we have had to pay to demolish it. It was just about ready to start. So
we actually paid we paid even more. Tax dollars went into destroying plans that were actually going to help us protect the environment.
Exactly, exactly. And then in November of 2018, he brought out his so-called climate plan. And it was so bad. You know, let's say the Liberals was a quarter loaf. These guys had crumbs on the table. And the so-called plan got a lot of bad reviews, and rightly, because it was completely inadequate. It was very vague. There were no real markers to show where we would wind up. And that was it. That was 2 years ago. Well, in I guess it was November, December of 2019, the Auditor General did her report on the so-called climate plan. And one of the things that was really startling, she said, many of the measures that are brought forward aren't based on evidence. Now, typically when you're planning to spend tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars or change the law, you try and do it based on evidence rather than on guesses and wishes. That was a damning report by the Environmental Commission, sorry, the Auditor General. And beyond that, she said, based on what has been put forward, you can't meet the goals that you say you're going to meet. You can't do it. That was a year ago. And you would have thought that the government, seeing such a damning report, would try and pull up its socks and actually have an impact. Well, we found out just within the last 30 days, another report from the environmental commissioner, who's part of the Auditor General's office, that not only have the Conservatives brought forward a completely inadequate, quote unquote, plan, that they weren't even following that. So one of the things that they had said in their plan was that we'd have a reduction in emissions because buildings would be more efficient in the way they used energy. Burn less gas, you get less greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. Well, in fact, they passed on the opportunity to revise the building code, which describes how you build a building, passed on the opportunity to make it more effective in reducing energy consumption. Huge lost opportunity. So they were ignoring their own so-called plan. Another thing that was supposed to help a lot was requiring a big investment in energy conservation in the homes that were served by Enbridge gas. But in fact, Enbridge was never told by the Ontario Energy Board, hey, you've got to go to the max. You've got to make the biggest investments to reduce people's heating bills and to reduce their emissions. And so again, the government was ignoring its own so-called plan. So if we thought in fall of 2018 that their plan was inadequate, well, apparently in some way, the government thought so too, because they've just ignored it. So we're in a situation now where I think it's fair to say, although numbers have not yet been published, that emissions have been climbing since they were elected, and that we're getting farther behind. We're not moving ahead on dealing with the climate crisis. We're getting farther behind. That is a huge problem. And Dolly, if you'll be generous and kind, and let me say one other thing. Yes, this attack on the conservation authorities ties into this because the conservation authorities, part of their job, and I know we'll go into greater depth later, is to protect people from flooding. And we know that we're going to see more flooding as the world gets hotter. Well, if you step in and make it impossible for the conservation authorities to protect us from flooding, you're just putting us at greater risk from climate-stoked problems. And so not only are they not trying to reduce the heating, they're reducing the protection that we should have from the impact of that global heating.
Well, I think we should talk about it right now, because we actually have quite a few of our audience members here who have joined, and they went straight to Schedule 6 because a lot of local people have been sending us petitions, signing petitions that we recently submitted. Many of, well, both of us as well as some of our colleagues have submitted, and we spoke in the House about Schedule 6, which is the attack on conservation authorities. And I have Brianne, Claire mentioned about Schedule 6 as well. And a shout out to all of you who have joined us. Thank you so much. It means a lot. This is an important issue, and we'll continue the conversation. Some of you have asked if there's a plan with specific solutions, specific targets, and we will get into that a little bit later on as well. And obviously watch out for the full detailed plan that we release sometimes very soon. But let's go back to Schedule 6 and sure. Talk about Bill 229 and Schedule 6.
Yeah, well, Bill 229 is supposed to be the COVID Recovery Act. So why an attack on the environment? I know that you can always tell with the Conservatives labeling a bill that whatever they say they're doing, something else is happening. So Schedule 6 is a revision of the powers of the conservation authorities and really gutting those powers, dramatically reducing their ability to protect the environment and to protect people. And one of the things that was really startling was that there were public hearings held on the bill, very limited hearings, frankly, not at all that were commensurate with the impact of the changes. So we had public hearings, and then after the public hearings, the Conservatives brought in a whole raft of amendments that further weakened the conservation authorities. One amendment they brought in took 20 minutes to read in committee. Well, it was longer than the schedule. And so the public was just completely locked out of actually having the impact they should have had. I think the critical thing that people need to understand is that the way the law is now written, that the minister Minister of Urban Affairs, can write a regulation, a zoning order that allows someone to build on environmentally sensitive land in a floodplain, and the conservation authorities can't block it. So in fact, the minister can say, I like this plan. I know the next time there's a giant flood that people's homes will be swept away, but really it's too important to this developer to make a fortune for me to stand in their way. And the conservation authorities, which can currently refuse to give permits, will be compelled by law to give a permit even when they've done an assessment showing that an installation is dangerous and a risk to human health, human life, human property. And I think that's one of the most astounding things. Dolly, you probably know, and my guess is many of the viewers know this, but we have conservation authorities were first put forward in the late 40s and then modified in the mid 50s, 1950s, because of the impact of Hurricane Hazel. People saw what could happen when you put family homes on a floodplain. Hurricane comes through in the middle of the night, homes are swept away, people are swept away, and people die. And Ontario did something quite extraordinary. And under a conservative government, let's face it, we put in place these conservation authorities whose job it was to protect human life and property from flooding. And they're a pretty unique institution because they don't follow municipal boundaries, they follow the watershed, which means they're far more comprehensive in their planning approach. What has been done with the Conservative government is effectively sweep away the powers that are needed to protect human life and human property. And our assessment, looking at these ministerial zoning orders that have been issued, I think there are about 38 that have been issued, far more that have been issued for decades. Our assessment is that the proponents tend to be tightly connected to the Conservative government, that they have been donors and allies for a long time. And in many ways, one can only think that this is just payback. You helped us win a campaign, we're going to give you all the legal permissions you need to build wherever you want. You can get some cheap land somewhere. We can make it incredibly valuable by rezoning it. And I think it's profoundly irresponsible and shows complete disrespect for the people of Ontario. I think that's a fairly good thumbnail impression of what's gone on with Bill 229 and Schedule 6 that had this attack in it.
I think just a little bit more in terms of the amount of people that came out in opposition to it was incredible. I mean, local people across the province spoke against it. It was so powerful. And there's quite a few folks who are also commenting, and I know that I just wanted to let you all know that we are seeing your comments, and we will talk a little bit about what you can do in terms, because I know there's a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, and we will channel that anger into doing some action that helps us undo this damage. But in terms of some of the folks that came out, we know David Crombie came out and actually resigned. There are other members of council who resigned as well. There are tons of organizations, environmental organizations, legal organizations that came out and told the ministries not to do this, told the government not to do this. And I found it kind of strange that there was sort of this dilemma between the Ministry of Housing and Municipal Affairs and Ministry of Environment. And it was almost like a slap in the face for this whole Ministry of Environment, where the Ministry of Housing just took over in the guise of COVID response.
I know.
And then we already have just these sort of entities like OMB, which is now a little bit changed, but it's been replaced, but it's the same thing.
Yeah, and the LPAT, yeah.
Exactly. We know exactly what they do. And we have in Scarborough Southwest, many of you who are watching, we know that we're dealing with similar issues in terms of some of the developments that have been approved despite opposition from local people, from residents who are neighbors, who live in these areas, who have opposed development. And then what happened, the OMB, or this entity that kind of favors developers all the time, the big developers. And now we have a government that's just kind of, enforcing this agenda and just pushing forward a little bit more, and helping them now pave through protected lands as well. So when we talk about the green belt, and it's interesting because someone mentioned it's 18 months till the next election. But do you remember in the previous election when we had the premier come out and talk about how he will open up the green belt and make it easier for people to just pave through the green belt, and how developers can just go in and he'll open it up and this is what will happen? And then he kind of changed his words and said, you know what, I won't do that. And here we are now. And this is exactly what he wants to do.
Yeah, I think it's really useful for you to have raised that example. And if you'll remember, he took a second kick at the can about a year in and had to back off.
Yeah.
First of all, never misunderstand this. This government is a tool of and a creature of development interest and speculator interest in Ontario. That's who they serve, not us, not the people of Ontario, not those who actually live in houses that are built. No, but the speculators and developers. That's who this government is. And so the drive to buy land cheap, rezone it, make it far more valuable is profound. And there's a lot of money to be made for a very small number of people. But I have to say, what Ford did with those two attacks on the Greenbelt is he poisoned the atmosphere for his government. Everyone will remember how he was received when he went to the Raptors celebration at Nathan Phillips Square. He was booed. And I think that rattled his whole government. And I think what he's doing now with the ministerial zoning orders and Schedule 6, the attack on the conservation authorities, I think he's reminding people who Doug Ford really is. Yeah. People may have felt during the first round on COVID that he was less bombastic, and he was less bombastic, that he was listening to the science, and mostly he did, not as much as he should have, but mostly he did. However, I think he felt that his approval numbers were so good the first time around that now he had a free hand and Doug could be Doug. But now that is falling away. And I think for many of us, and many of you who are watching this presentation this evening, the reality is until he and his government understand that they are poisoning the well for themselves, that they are dooming themselves politically, they can't be moved. Now, they're doing most of the work in terms of poisoning that well, but it's our responsibility, not just you and me, Dolly, as members of the official opposition, but for the public out there to make sure that no friend, no relative, no acquaintance goes without being informed of how damaging the Ford government is to the people of this province. That needs to seep out into the ridings where Conservatives are currently members. And they need to feel that their futures as politicians are going to be very short. And that is the only way to force this government to back off and back down. Now, they may not throw out Schedule 6 right away, but I have to say, if they don't change their course, they will be thrown out as a government. I think it's very clear. And people need to make sure that whenever Doug Ford appears in public, he gets just as warm a welcome as he did at the Raptors celebration. That will catch his attention.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think people are already feeling it, and I think the government's feeling it as well. Yeah. Because the way they expedited the clause by clause hearing on from Thursday, Friday, and then over the weekend we saw multiple people resign and the outcry, and then on Monday the government decided to, you know what, we're going to finish the debate on the final reading of this bill, and on Tuesday morning was the vote. And we have seen the government do this kind of things exactly right after they were elected, when they had Bill 5, which was the cutting down on the amount of councillors we have in Toronto. Attack on democracy, really. A big shout out to my friend Miles Magner, who joined us here as well. And he also mentioned, it's a huge issue. Do you think the passing of Schedule 6 means we need to gear up to fight specific projects and ministerial zoning orders? It should be possible to mobilize substantial actions to stop projects like Duffin Creek Marsh or the proposed GO Railroad rail yard in the Don Valley. Yeah.
I think, Miles, you've got a good point that fighting individual projects makes a lot of sense. I think developers should begin to feel that being connected to the Ford government and an MZO, a ministerial zoning order, is something that damages their reputation. And to the extent that builders start realizing that the Ford touch is something that will drive people away from them, that will discredit their brand and their standing in the community, that's an advantage. It needs to be seen that from every angle, being connected to this government and its works is a negative. And so you're right, going after individual projects makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and they do this a lot in terms of giving favors to their friends, and that was from developments to plates. The fact that they couldn't get license plates right, and there was something in it for them. That there's always some sort of partisan favor happening with this Ford government.
Yeah, or stickers on gas pumps. I mean, they're just. I mean, mostly I think that they're nasty and destructive, but occasionally they show flashes of incompetence.
Yes, absolutely. There are folks who are asking many questions, and I promise I will try my very best to get to all of the questions as we go through this evening. Claire, Ward, very nice to see you, my friend. Dawn. We also have Ingrid. Big shout out to Ingrid, who joins many of our lives. I'm gonna pick another question right here. Roshana Ranu Kala also joined. Big shout out to you. So one of the things that we keep seeing right now is we know we have to figure out what to do and obviously vote this government out. But Claire asked if we see an early election. I would love to see collaboration between all progressives. Well, we progressives, I think, and I'm sure Peter will talk more about this in terms of the fight to protect our environment, housing, all of the work that we do. We always welcome all progressives to unite and fight this together. She also said stopping this government is the swiftest way to stop the damage. I think their ethics are whack. 100%. 100%, Don.
That's a good summary. It's a really good summary.
And absolutely. There's also other comments about how he's wasted money fighting the feds in court.
Yes.
We have also seen how the government has wasted money just recently in the middle of a pandemic when it came to consultation. So around $3 million on just how they should position themselves when it came to the reopening of school. So not the actual reopening the school
Yes.
of schools or the safety plans, but how should they position themselves? And it was McKinsey that got all that money, the tax dollars from people, just so that government could figure out how they should position themselves. And this is the type of government that we have.
Yeah, it is. It's true. All about, well, I was going to say all about image, but no, it's all about making developer friends wealthy. And then after that comes image, and way down the line actually helping people. Yeah.
I noticed one of the things that has the government has done is not only, and Ward has asked about this as well, is Indigenous rights. We noticed that when the government was elected, they did not have, their throne speech did not have real actions to address, well, to talk about reconciliation, to talk about how do we address the crisis with, clean water, broadband. And then now, obviously, with this attack on the environment, just your experience, and obviously, we have Sol Mamakwa in our caucus who's been fighting for some of the specific things in many of his communities. And thank you, Ward, for pointing this out. Just any Indigenous rights issues, and what are we seeing right now happen?
Well, I think what's happening with Niskantega and the boil water, well, the lack of water situation is pretty indicative. My heart goes out to those people who, for decades now, have had trouble getting clean water. And Saul Mamakwa, our MPP from Kikwetnong, is thundering on this regularly in the House because no one should be treated the way that community has been treated. And yet it's clear that it's just not on the radar of this government. And I think that's representative of their whole approach. They are not interested in the consultation that's required. They're not interested in the well-being of the people in those communities. And it's a very good case study of everything that's wrong with a government that puts people last and puts democracy, public consultation, public consideration, just outside its list of consideration. Too focused on the privileged few, not interested in the many.
Yeah, and I remember it was weeks and weeks. For weeks he's been just saying, well, they're on a boiled water advisory. Now it's been 6 weeks, now 8 weeks, and it's just continued on. And we get a lot of lip service when it comes to addressing these issues. Yep. Now, if we were to talk about a little bit about, and because a lot of folks I know are very, very curious in terms of, what do we do? And one of the things that's been suggested is an ethics inquiry or some sort of action by the public that could be done right now. So we've been obviously we have a petition ready that we're circulating, and for those of you who are watching, we will put that on the comments so that we can definitely have you sign it. Please share it with your family, friends, send them to, and then obviously send them back to us so that we can submit them to the clerks in the legislature, and we do make sure that that happens. But some of the other things you can do is organize. And I know because of the pandemic, it's a little different in terms of how you organize. But we've been organizing virtually, we've been phone calling, and we also, if there's anyone who's been sending an email to the premier or the ministers, CC us. Let us know what you're telling the government so that we can make sure that we hold the government accountable and let them know that we can see what's happening, what people are saying to them, and ask the questions and follow up on the questions that you're asking the government. Peter, you've been in politics much, much longer, my friend, than I have. What have you found to be effective in this fight for environment that people can work on?
Well, the number one thing that's effective is mobilizing a majority of people and a coalition of forces to defeat the government. And I think there are two levels there, Dolly. And the first is, until this government is actually thrown out, it's going to be very difficult to put in place what's needed. But the other thing is, then when it's clear that there's a coalition of forces out there that can drive a government from power, suddenly governments are more amenable to reasonable suggestions. But they will only move when they think they're going to be driven out of power. So I'm going to go back to something that Miles said earlier. Each MZO project comes forward, there are going to be proponents who are tied to it. And their names have to be tied to Doug Ford's name. So I don't know the name of the companies that are tied up with their paving over the wetland in Ajax, Duffins Creek. But whoever is involved in Toronto, their name should be tied to environmental destruction. Yeah. So that companies that are dealing with the Ford government know that it's going to be bad publicity for them. And if you're constantly getting bad publicity by working with someone, after a while, you're going to be a lot more cautious about working with them. I know someone talked about an ethics inquiry. It's very hard to call an inquiry if the majority, the government, controls the votes in committees. So right now we couldn't force that. In a minority government situation, we're able to do that with the Liberals. We're able to force the gas plant inquiry. And that was a revelation about the way that they operated. I mean, you blow $1 billion, you catch people's attention, and they did, and they engaged in records destruction. They actually took us in the wrong direction on our electricity system. And the minority government situation allowed us to actually dig into that in a way that you can't otherwise. So I don't think we can count on us being able to use the committee structure at Queen's Park to hold them to account. It's going to be outside Queen's Park. It's going to be making the public aware of who the bad actors are and how they're connected to Ford and how they promoted the destruction of the conservation authorities, how they promoted the war on the environment that Doug Ford's engaged in. Those mobilizations make a lot of sense. And you're right, it's unfortunate. We can't all come together in a demonstration in our thousands in person right now, but virtually, one can start social media waves and make sure that an issue is trending to the extent that you catch a company's attention. And I think that's something that people can do now.
Yeah. My friend Claire also said, I think the Pickering wetland is going to be an Amazon warehouse. That just, I also have Kathleen, shout out to Kathleen Dorr, who joined us as well, who said, who can get us the names of the companies profiting from Schedule 6 and who are donors of conservatives? And that's a very, very smart comment Kathleen just made, which is once you start making those connections between the donors of the government, of many of our politicians, and then looking at who's benefiting from things like Schedule 6, you start to see some of the connections. And we've seen that in the past as well with quite a few other scandals that the Ford government has already had. Miles also said make MZOs and no go. Yeah, we agree, absolutely. I think it's, and for those of you who are wondering, if we were in government, we would make sure that that schedule is removed. There's a lot
absolutely
to undo, and I just want to get it out there so that's very, very clear for folks. There's a lot of things we would do. And on that thought, I want to go into some of the ideas. I know we haven't fully released the plan yet, but just some of the ideas that we started with in terms of how would we address and what are some of the things that are important to do now when we talk about the way government can address climate crisis.
Okay, thanks. And you're right. We came out, man, it was more than a year ago. The COVID has thrown everything for a loop. All kinds of plans got delayed and set aside. But in the summer of 2019, we came out with the outline of our Green New Democratic deal.
And people loved it. I'm sorry to interrupt. That people loved it. We had such amazing interaction from people with the Green New Democratic deal, and people had many great suggestions for it, which is what shaped many of our plans. And one of the things that people talked about is how do we make sure that the way to address anything to do with the environment is not done on like a silo. Like it's along with everything else. It's along with government's planning. And go ahead. I got very excited and I remembered last year when we announced it, and we had a lot of local people who were very excited as well across the city.
Well, I was pretty excited as well. I was very happy that that's the direction we were taking, to tell you the truth. And we talked about a few things there, a lot of which we fleshed out, and we're hoping early in the new year to present the plan in its entirety. There's some refining that still has to go on, but I think the critical things that people need to know about is that we set the target for the level of reductions that's going to be required to at least get close to meeting the targets that were set out in the Paris Agreement, at least help us avoid the worst of the climate crisis. So a reduction in emissions in Ontario by 50%, less than they were in 2005, pretty ambitious goal, but not just ambitious, but also absolutely necessary. That's where we have to go. You should know, Dolly, and the audience should know that Ontario spends, depending on the price of oil, anywhere between $14 and $24 billion a year on imports of fossil fuels. So that's a huge amount of money that flows out of our economy every year. And we made it very clear in our initial document that if we were actually able to take that money and spend it in Ontario on people insulating houses, on putting in place geothermal heating systems. If we were to use that money for transit as opposed to buying gasoline, we could increase the wealth of Ontario quite dramatically, put a lot of people to work. And that was very much a reflection, or very much reflected even in our initial approach. One of the things that we proposed, because it is the most cost-effective, creates an awful lot of work, cuts people's heating bills and energy bills, is a very large-scale energy retrofit of buildings, houses and commercial buildings, institutional buildings right across the province. And it was our goal in our initial document, and we've retained that, to be retrofitting 5% of the houses in Ontario every year until every house has been retrofitted and is operating on a net zero basis. Well, that's about 200,000 houses a year. We're talking about a very substantial industry. And that puts tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to work. That can allow us to cut greenhouse gas emissions quite dramatically. You don't need any new technology. You aren't having to reinvent the wheel, because in a lot of countries, what's needed to be done has already been demonstrated on a commercial basis. What you need is a government willing to make the commitment and willing to put in place all the other pieces, which is more training, large-scale hiring, and putting in place the rules and the building code that allows it to go forward. Now, here in Ontario, if we are able to get that rolling, we find that about a quarter of our emissions are from building stock, and bringing that forward would allow us, again, on a cost-effective basis, on a technologically viable basis, to take on those big issues and take them on fast. So I know that we will be rolling out more in terms of energy and in terms of transportation, in terms of industry. But the other thing I really want to touch on, I know we don't have infinite time this evening, is addressing social equity issues at the same time. Dealing with reconciliation with First Nations, dealing with marginalization of women and the Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. One of the things that we learned from looking at the experience in World War II, when we were engaged in reshaping the economy, was that you actually had to have programs that promoted social equity in order to retain people's support for these kinds of measures. So not only is there an opportunity to address injustices that need to be addressed, and which I think makes most of us feel really good, because we want those things addressed and we want them now. So we have a vehicle to do that. But also, if you're going to retain people's morale and commitment to the kind of transformation that's needed, they need to see that it's more than just a question of insulating houses, that it's also a question of making sure that we have a freer, more equitable and safer society in which everyone has a chance to have a decent standard of living. And I think if you can bring all those pieces together, then you have a package that can really move a whole society and keep that society together through what will be a complex process. I have to say to you, fossil fuel companies are not going to roll over. They are going to resist measures that reduce the consumption of their product. And we as a social movement, and we as a government, we as a party, are going to have to do a lot of work to keep people united. And so addressing those equity issues, addressing those issues of economic inequality, along with addressing the climate crisis, all fit together in a piece. And I guess I should just add, and I may have said it at the very beginning, because of the impact of COVID on the economy, the economic benefits of this package are even more to the forefront in people's thinking, because people are having a very tough time. People's standard of living has dropped. The next year looks very perilous. And if you can bring forward a project that deals with inequity, deals with the climate crisis, and helps repair the economic damage from COVID, I think you've got a package that works for people.
Thank you. That was a great summary
Oh,
of something
thanks.
that we've been working on, and some of the questions that people have asked as well. I think there's there's an attempt by especially the Ford government is to make it seem like when we address climate crisis, when we address some of the challenges in our day-to-day behaviors, and the way we look at some of the big polluters and how we change and meet our targets is always sort of a way that will punish people, or we're going to take away, we're going to undermine the way people have an affordable life. And it's so incredible to actually kind of I mean, I always like to shut them up and say no, that's not true. But I always I also want to make sure that people who are watching know that the plan that we will come up with and that we were working on right now actually talks about how do we have something that's more equitable. How does the plan focuses on people? How do we make sure that we have COVID response in that framework as well, because we know people are struggling right now.
Yeah.
And they're not mutually exclusive. There's a lot of ways we can actually make sure that people have jobs. We can make sure that we actually address this in a very equitable way, and you don't have to, the whole conservative rhetoric is always going to be trying to separate the two, and they're not separate. They're the same. And what we see in many of our communities right now is the way, whether it's development affecting marginalized communities, or how indigenous communities have been impacted because of the way we are not protecting our environment, really shows how important it is for us to make sure that equity is part of the
Yes.
way we deal with climate crisis as well. Yeah, so I mean, and I also want to give a big shout out to folks who have just joined in as well. Thank you so much for watching. Saifullah Dulal, Ainun Afruza joined, Word joined, Charles. Big shout out to all of you. Many of you join all the time, so thank you so much. Ainun said, really appreciate for bringing the issues of climate change, climate and peace. Basic income is a good start, said Word. Smith, Dawn talked about, I love that you have targets. Do you have ways to get there? And we definitely will have those answers for you as well when we put out the full plan. If I missed anyone, any of your questions, we will try our best to comment and answer your questions. Because we're about 5 minutes from wrapping up, I want to give Peter a chance to share any other thoughts that he has, because this is a big topic, and there's so much that we could talk about. And obviously, as you all know, this new normal series are not one-off. We're going to do many more conversations about the issues that affect us on our day-to-day lives. So if you ever have any concerns about any of the things that we're talking about today or anything else, please do not hesitate to reach out to my office, or just leave a comment here and we'll make sure that we get in touch with you. So over to you, Peter, to wrap up and give us some concluding remarks.
Okay. Well, Dolly, thanks. And again, thanks for having me this evening. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and to talk with the people who are following this, this webinar, this broadcast. We do have an opportunity to control our future. It's not going to be an easy opportunity, but it's a very big opportunity. And to the extent that people are mobilized politically, to the extent that they are willing to put forward the energy needed to mobilize a majority that can reshape the future, it can be extraordinarily rewarding. We know that just from recent history, that when we're challenged, we can take on those challenges. We have the smarts, we have the knowledge, we have the institutions and mechanisms to actually come to grips with the most pressing problems of the day. And I don't think we should waste this opportunity. We should take it on. We know that the stakes are high if we get it wrong, which is why we need to ensure that governments that are anti-environment don't get reelected, that they suffer the punishment for it. And I would say that in the next few years, we have the opportunity to put in place a progressive government. Now, as you're well aware, Dolly, I think of us as the natural progressive party for running this province. And I think that we have a program, and we will have a program when the Green New Democratic Deal is rolled out, that I think people can get behind, and that, if implemented, would actually allow us to take on the climate crisis in a way that we haven't seen in Ontario before. I'm hopeful. I'm
Me too.
I'm very hopeful. I don't like the risks. I don't like the threats. They're a motivator, but the hope and the optimism really are what I think give us the strength to carry through. And with that, I look forward to working with you and for all those who've joined us this evening, because we're going to have an opportunity, I think, to do amazing things together.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for joining me today, for giving me the time to talk a lot about some of the questions that have come in. To all of you who have joined us, Lisa, we had Bob. Thank you, all of you who have joined after as well. I just wanted to take a moment to say, and I'm just seeing some other comments about, young people who are stressed and how they're feeling and how passionate they feel about these issues as well, and they understand these issues. But what do we do to make sure that we mobilize them as well? And so please stay connected with our social media, get connected with our office, because there are different ways we are organizing. There are different ways we're connecting with local people. And all of you watching here, your family, friends, if they want to ever get into any of the work that we're doing, any of the campaigns that we're working on, please feel free to connect with us, because there's always things that we could do. There's always work to be done. And obviously, the goal is to make sure that we elect a progressive government that is going to do exactly the things that we just talked about. And until then, we need to organize, we need to mobilize, and young people are a very important part of that. I want to also give a big shout out to Maisha, who's been on the back end, making sure that everyone's getting their questions up and helping us run through this. And before I end off, I just wanted to say a big shout out to the Scarborough Bluffs Community Association that does work in our community, which is where their sweater is from, this Scarborough Bluff sweater that I'm wearing right now. And I'm very glad to be representing Scarborough. So thank you, all of you, for joining us this evening. We'll be back with another fantastic session of New Normal series, and to talk about another big issue. Until then, have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much. Stay safe and stay home.